John Dimsdale es profesor del Departamento de Psiquiatría de la Universidad de California en San Diego. Pero no solo eso, él es profesor emérito, distinguido y profesor en investigación del departamento. Él estuvo previamente en la facultad de la Escuela de Medicina de Harvard. Es un investigador activo que ha recibido reconocimientos por su carrera por la American Heart Association. Ha sido presidente de la Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research, de la American Psychosomatic Society y de la Society of Behavioral Medicine. Como se dan cuenta por esos títulos, pues es un experto en medicina psicosomática. Entonces presumo que fue mi profesor y con él es que hice la subespecialidad ahí en la Joya. También ha sido asesor para la Comisión de Salud Mental Presidencial, para el Instituto de Medicina de Estados Unidos y para la National Academy of Sciences. Ha sido revisor de propuestas para fondos de investigación de los institutos de salud de Estados Unidos y ha editado múltiples libros. Ha sido autor de más de 500 artículos científicos y ahora no solo se entretiene haciendo actividad científica, también nos va a presentar su libro Anatomy of Malice, The Enigma of the Nazi War Criminals. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Bernardo. One of the joys of being a professor is having wonderful students, and I think Bernardo has been teaching me for at least 30 years, and it's always a pleasure to see him. I'd like to thank the Mexican Psychiatric Association for inviting me to speak here. I understand this is an anniversary, a 50th year anniversary. My congratulations to you. In a way, my talk this morning is also an anniversary, but of something far darker, and that has to do with the anniversary of the Nuremberg War Crimes trial and psychiatry's participation in the trial. It may interest some of you in the audience to learn that the first ever consecutive international translation occurred at the Nuremberg War Crimes trial. So to the colleagues in the back, thank you for your efforts. You know, we as psychiatrists deal with malice in our offices frequently. We see bad fate, we see bad things happen to people, not just existential bad luck of an illness or an accident, but we also see terrible things that have been done. Curiously, not many of us have the experience of treating world leaders who have committed such acts of malice, and yet that is exactly what happened 70 years ago. Research must address enduring questions, and questions that straddle medicine, history, and our ideas of the nature of humanity are important. And my book, Anatomy of Malice, looks at such questions in the context of the Nuremberg War Crimes trial. The Nazi hierarchy certainly embodied the essence of malice. What drove them? That question captivated the world 70 years ago, just as similar questions of malice in world leaders attracts our attention today. My book will discuss essentially two psychiatrists and their roles at the Nuremberg war crimes trial, what they learned from the war criminals, what this learning did to them in their lives, and why, as a result of all this, their work has been locked up for all these years. By the end of the war, millions of non-combatants have perished and been murdered, and Europe was in ruins, and the world was determined to understand the malice of the Nazi leaders. Those of you who remember Peter Townsend and who may remember this song, no one knows what it's like to be the bad man, to be the sad man behind blue eyes. No one knows what it's like to be hated, to be faded, to telling only lies. But my dreams, they aren't as empty as my conscience seems to be. How could the war criminals do what they did? Were they suffering from psychiatric disorder? Were they criminally insane, psychopaths, sadists, delusional? What did those words mean 70 years ago? What do they mean today? Before describing this research on the perpetrators, it's useful to review their deeds. Mass murders have a peculiar sense of familiarity because they echo our images of the desolation of hell from paintings of the 16th century. The critic George Steiner pointed out the concentration camps are the transfers of hell from below the earth to the surface. The camps embody, often down to minutiae, the images and chronicles of hell in European art and thought. Flame, the racking, the mockery of the damned, in a place of whips and hellhounds, of ovens and stinking air. There were, of course, many targets of the Nazi genocide. The dots on this map are not just dots of locations of cities in Greater Germany, but rather are some of the locations of the 40,000 concentration camps, extermination camps, slave labor camps, ghettos, POW camps, and euthanasia centers which dotted the landscape. This was part of a vast industry of slave labor and murder. There would be retribution for these crimes, and for a time the Allies couldn't agree about the process. Thus, they settled the captured Nazi Party cabinet ministers in a luxury spa in Luxembourg, Mondorf, Luxembourg, and the code name of this spa was Ash Camp. Security was so tight that in order to gain access, you needed a pass from God and someone to vouch for his signature. The war criminals posed on the veranda of the spa hotel and were nicknamed the Class of 1945. History is filled with coincidences. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith was on the scene in those days, and he sensed the drama looming behind these walls. He wrote, "Suppose someone had written a play and put all these characters on the stage. When the curtain went up, the playbill would have read, 'A jail in Luxembourg in June 1945. While the Allies posed on the veranda at Ash Camp, the Allies debated if and where and how a war crimes trial might be held. To anticipate a question if we get to discussion, war crimes trials are very rare. a matter of fact, the International Criminal Court, the United States doesn't belong, Russia dropping out, China doesn't belong. The whole process of an international war crimes trial is a rare occurrence in history. The Allies settled on Nuremberg. When the war ended, Nuremberg was virtually destroyed. But paradoxically, the courthouse and the prison survived, and the war criminals were transferred to the Nuremberg prison. Many people ask me how I got involved in this research. As Bernardo knows, I spent the bulk of my life I've spent the bulk of my life in that center part. I've spent the bulk of my years working in clinical research in the center part of that picture. That was my office at Harvard. I was in that little garret office. The young faculty always get the worst offices. Was sitting in my office one day when there was a loud knock on my door, and I was startled because I wasn't expecting anyone, and the building had few visitors. A stocky man walked in saying without any preamble, "I am the executioner, and I have come for you." He pushed his way into my office, sat down on my sofa, gestured to his gun case, and I said a quiet little prayer to myself. I also wondered who I had managed to piss off so profoundly. When he opened the case, I saw that it was not a gun case after all, but it was a document case, an outpoured document from World War II. He said to me, "I was the Nuremberg executioner, and these documents prove that I am who I say I am." He went on to tell me that while he was proud of his job, and that while still being professional about it, he enjoyed hanging the criminals. They were scum, Dimsdale, and you need to be starting to study them. This was a dark challenge, and not one that I was anxious to take up. And besides, how could I interview the dead? Then I discovered the miracle of archives. And I'd like to encourage some of you who have history in your own society 50 years ago, dig into the archives, find out what is there. Archives are strange things. They always give an incomplete picture, but sometimes you can extrapolate and perceive outlines accurately. The thing about archives is that they are wildly discrepant. On the one hand, in places like the National Archives, these are vast vaults. Each one of those boxes is a banker's vault, and there's a robot at the end of the hall that comes and retrieves things. But the essence of an archives is that no one knows what's in there. The librarian doesn't know what's in there. The librarian's job is to keep them safe. So the box might be labeled Nuremberg 1945, but it could have baptismal records, or death certificates, or wills. There's no way of knowing what's there. At the other extreme, a lady from the mountains outside of San Diego, from Julian, knocked on my door last year, telling me that she had a half a dozen cardboard boxes stored in her garage up in the mountains, something from Germany, and would I look at them? So you can imagine what shape these cardboard boxes were in a garage in the mountains for 40 years. I highlighted one of the documents. You could see the rat gnawing and the mold. There was a nest in the documents, acorns that started sprouting, and they were in fact relevant documents. So the archives are everywhere. I looked in the likely places, but I also looked in unlikely places. And it gets to people find out that you're interested, and they give you information. I focused in this whole endeavor not so much on the perpetrators of the crime, but the orchestrators. That's an important distinction I'd like to take a moment about. You know, if you were a German soldier, if you were a villager, you could say you were just following orders. But if you were a cabinet minister, you had a degree of agency or control. And those are the people I wanted to study most carefully. On one of my first trips, I went to the Library of Congress. I showed this to my residents. None of them had ever seen a telegram before. So it's a dated bit of information. It's an unusual telegram from Harvard criminologist Sheldon Gluck. He's writing to Justice Jackson and the OSS. And I'll just read out a portion of the telegram. Gluck suggested that a thorough examination be made of the war criminals, the psychiatrists, psychologists, and anthropologists knowledgeable about the Rorschach. In fact, there were many letters like this deep in the archives, correspondence between unlikely professional societies, psychoanalytic society, psychosomatic society, neurology association. All of these associations were writing. I think it's safe to say today that the only thing that these societies would agree about were they would wish for a greater budget for the National Institute of Health. But that said, they wrote requesting study the war criminals, give them Rorschachs, save their brains for study, and then, as a quote, if and when the accused has been convicted and sentenced to death, it would be desirable to have a detailed autopsy, especially of the brain. Therefore, it is urged that the convicted be found in the chest and not in the head. You know, the comment about the Rorschach might be surprising, and I'd like to take a short detour back to Switzerland to talk about Hermann Rorschach. Hermann Rorschach looks just like Brad Pitt. Astonishing resemblance. He was brilliant. His whole career was torn between a fascination with art and in medicine. As a young assistant professor, he developed the Rorschach test, but he couldn't get anyone to publish it. And it was published only a year before he died. He died tragically young of a ruptured appendix. And when he died in 1922, Hermann Rorschach certainly had no idea that another world war was looming that brought with it new levels of barbarity, or that people would turn to his test for answers. I'm not sure how widely the Rorschach is used. It's hard to see against the lights. How many of you use a Rorschach? It's not widely used in the United States anymore. It looks like that's about the same here. So the investigator asked the subject 2 questions. And there are 10 cards. The first question is, what might this be? And the second is, well, what made you say that? There are 10 cards that are scored, and the scoring is quite complex. It's not at all just on the free association of the patient. Instead, the scorer is looking at whether you're responding to shadow, to color, to movement in the figure. It's a powerful test, but there have always been problems with interpreting Rorschach. So, matter of fact, in Shakespeare, in Hamlet is teasing Polonius. Hamlet says, "Do you see yonder cloud up there that's shaped like a camel?" Polonius says, "By the mass, it is like a camel indeed." Hamlet, "Methinks it's a weasel." Polonius, "Well, it is packed like a weasel." Hamlet says, "Or like a whale." Polonius says, "Yes, indeed, a whale." So this process of suggesting an image is treacherous for Rorschach. How are you going to interpret Rorschach if you know that you have a Nazi cabinet minister's Rorschach in front of you? The assumption is that the defendants were depraved psychopaths, but what does that mean? And how do you prove it? In fact, they were a very heterogeneous group of high-ranking defendants who loathed each other. This is typical in any cabinet. Hess was occasionally delusional and frequently claimed amnesia. Stryker was so objectionable that he had been kept under house arrest by the Nazis throughout the war. Psychiatrist Douglas Kelly and psychologist Gustav Gilbert were brilliant young clinicians who happened to be on the spot, working at the prison. They had traditional roles for psychiatrists. They were to determine the fitness for trial. They were also supposed to support the prisoner's morale while they waited at trial. However, this being an international military tribunal, the confidentiality was non-existent. They also were advising the prosecution about what the defendants were saying. But in addition to these public aspects of their job, they had two audacious goals of their own. They, on their own, decided to investigate the psychopathology of the Nazi leaders, and they decided to pursue their own ambitions. The prison authorities were quite concerned about suicide. It's a problem in the new jail. And the prisoners were held in solitary cells. Imagine being a psychiatrist responsible for their well-being. Imagine with all of the cameras and reporters of the world watching. In fact, there were numerous suicides in that jail. As an example, I got some data from Berlin in 1945. We all we're captives of history, and you could see the impact of history on vital statistics of Berlin with the Russians at the gate in April 1945. Look at that change in suicide rate. These were very, very dark times. Robert Ley is probably the least well-known war criminal. He was the head of the German Labor Front. He authorized numerous war crimes, killed off any union leaders that were oppositional to the Nazis. He has an interesting medical history. Has a history of multiple head injuries and episodes of unconsciousness. He was a plane crash survivor, unconscious for days, and when he awoke for the rest of his life, spoke with a stammer, a mild aphasia perhaps. In addition, he was a severe alcoholic, a well-nourished alcoholic, but a severe alcoholic. All of this left him with a stammer and impulsivity, and there was a lot of concern about him. his well-being. Psychiatrist Kelly evaluated Lay in October 1945, and this is part of the fun of delving into archives. If you delve into your hospital records from 50 years ago, some things will look familiar, some things will look strange. Listen to Kelly's mental status exam from 1945. Normal psychomotor reactions and normal attitudes and behavior. Mood is normal, but affect is extremely labile. The Rorschach examination reveals emotional instability and evidence of frontal lobe damage. He is one of the most potentially suicidal prisoners due to his extreme instability secondary to his old head injury. Lay is competent. Lay hanged himself the next day. Kelly writes sardonically, since Lay kindly made his brain available for post-mortem examination, we were presented with a rare chance to verify our clinical and Rorschach findings. There was a great deal of interest in this brain of a Nazi cabinet minister, and the popular press claimed the findings were sufficient to account for Lay's unusual behavior. Life magazine ran a story showing the greatest neuropathologist of the day, and Walter Reed, doing the brain cut. Brett Haymaker, the neuropathologist, reported long-standing degenerative processes in the frontal lobe, consistent with chronic encephalopathy. Lay's brain had an interesting journey. It flew from Germany to Washington, to California, to Washington, back and forth, getting second and third opinions. So what did the brain show as the neuropathologist looked at this closer and closer and closer in fine detail? What could they perceive? Did they see malice? Were they expecting to find a singular area labeled malice? It's still a riddle. I have access at the brain, but I'm not sure I'll do much better 70 years later. So, Warren was certainly a major defendant of the war crimes trial. He arrived at jail with 49 suitcases and lots of flashy jewelry and all of Germany's terracotta supply. Goering was an addict. Kelly spent 80 hours interviewing Goering. Very small cells, no chairs, just a cot. So he sat on this cot that sat under Goering's enormous girth and weight, sat next to him. What's it like to sit next to someone that close, to smell them, to kind of feel them right next to you? Goering was described as charming, confident, cynical. He regarded the trial as victor's justice. And I pulled this quote, and this quote has a disturbingly contemporary ring to it. The people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That's easy. All you have to do is tell them that they're being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. Reading Kelly's notes, our colleague from 70 years ago, you start to get a sense of him as a clinician. Goering started going through withdrawal. Goering was very proud. I suggested to him that while weaker men, like Ribbentrop, whom he loathed, they might require doses of medicine should they be withdrawn from a drug habit. But he, Goering, being strong and forceful, would probably require nothing. Goering readily agreed and went cold turkey. Similarly, Goering weighed 280 pounds on capture. Goering was 5'5". Kelly was worried about Goering's heart and appealed to Goering's narcissism. When I pointed out to him that he would make a better appearance in court should he lose some weight, he agreed and lost 60 pounds in 5 months of dieting. Goering killed himself with cyanide 1 hour before he was to be hanged. And to this day, there is a mystery about where the cyanide came from. Oddly enough, lots of people have claimed, I gave him the cyanide. No, I did. People are fighting for the honor of having given him cyanide. One of the other leading defendants was Julius Stryker. He was editor of a pornographic anti-Semitic newspaper. He was kind of a Hannibal Lecter with a typewriter. He urged his followers to beat up his political opponents and accused his competitors, even within his own party, of sexual inadequacy. I'm not making this up. This is straight out of 75 or 80 years ago. While Goering could be affable if he chose to be, no one found Stryker affable. Indeed, as I mentioned, he was so loathsome that he'd been kept in house arrest throughout the war. Rudolf Hess was the deputy Führer, and he was the other major defendant. He complained of amnesia and numerous somatic ailments. He was intermittently suspicious and saved samples of his food. This envelope with the red sealing wax, I found that in a basement in Silver Springs, Maryland. Hess had tucked in samples of his crackers and sealed it. The envelope says this is brain poison. And when Hess met the Swiss ambassador, he gave the Swiss ambassador this and asked him to be assayed to prove that they were being poisoned. The assay came back flour, baking soda, sugar. Sometimes Hess wouldn't talk with the psychiatrist until the psychiatrist had tasted the food first. Kelly and Gilbert describe him similarly as emotionally withdrawn, preoccupied, and suspicious. Well, let's meet the two protagonists here. Douglas Kelly was a child prodigy. He was a genius. He was one of Terman's study, the highest 0.5% of all the IQs in the state of California. He's an old line in California. His forebears had helped rescue the Donner Party up in the Sierras. He was a Columbia graduate and expert in forensics. He was a Rorschach expert, but sadly spoke no German. He had a very intense relationship with Goering. He wrote that Goering is one of the easiest to get along with. Each day when I came to his cell, he would jump up from his chair, greet me with a broad smile and outstretched arm, escort me to his cot, and pat the middle of the cot with his great paw. Good morning, doctor. I'm so glad you've come to see me. Please sit down, doctor. Sit here. Then he would ease his own great body down beside me, ready to answer my questions. He was charming when he chose to be charming, had excellent intelligence, keen imagination, great drive, and sense of humor. Goering regarded Kelly as a well-connected fixer. Kelly agreed to smuggle letters from Goering out of the prison to his wife. And Goering writes his wife, "Today I can send you a letter direct. Major Kelly, the director who is treating you and who has my fullest confidence, is bringing it to you. You can also talk to him freely." Goering offered Kelly one of his enormous rings in Venice for this mission. And Kelly responded, no, I can't do that. And then Goering said, then I'll give you something more valuable than that, a signed autograph of me. Gustav Gilbert was an American psychologist of Austrian Jewish background. He was raised in very different social circumstances, raised in great poverty in New York City. And in Gilbert's findings, one senses more of a feeling of hatred for the Nazis. Kelly was just trying to get them to trial and to study them intellectually. Gilbert loathed them. And for him, it was a very personal matter. He also went to Columbia, knew very little about Rorschach, but was totally fluent in German. Therein is the problem. I tell my trainees, be careful who you collaborate with. A good collaboration is like a good marriage. A bad collaboration is like a bad marriage filled with lawyers and stalking. And that's what happened to Gilbert and Kelly. Kelly designed the research testing protocol. It was never introduced in evidence at the trial. And the criminals actually enjoyed the testing. They competed with each other, bragged about their IQs, like they were kids doing an SAT test or college board test. After the war, Kelly moved to University of California, Berkeley, and was an editor. And he concluded that Nazism is a socio-cultural disease, and he had 22 flasks to study in pure culture. Well, let's practice. I don't have clickers like the previous speakers, but please take a look at this one Rorschach card and think. You don't have to call out. Think what you see on the card. Remember that there are 10 cards. So Hans Frisch of the propaganda ministry says there are two dancing bears, very clear, or gnomes or dwarfs. It makes a revolting impression, not at all friendly. The bloody color makes me feel uncomfortable. Robert Lay, who had already hanged himself, a butterfly, there are colors here, black and red and white. Then he starts perseverating. Remember his brain injury, black and red and white. A stork or goose would be better. It looks like it was tipped over with its legs pulled in. I see the jaws of a butterfly. Hermann Goering laughs, says those are two dancing figures, very clear. Shoulder here in the face there. He claps his hand, holds his hand up, kind of cuts off the